Everyone has heard of King John, the tyrant forced to go to war with his barons, leading to the signing of the Magna Carta. People probably know him from Robin Hood or other Hollywood productions. But I'm not here to delve into the realms of mythology, hearsay or legend. My mission is to unveil the man behind the myth. Who was King John? In the spring of 1203, Philip Augustus of France was still on the rampage, seeking revenge for the apparent murder of the boy Arthur of Brittany. The French were going by two contemporary accounts that said John was possessed with rage like the devil and crushed the boy's skull with a rock before slinging his body in the Seine. Possibly even killed by William the Brosse. Oddly, William Marshall's histories fall silent over the matter, suggesting even he knew the truth. This was the darkest hour for King John, something that would haunt him for the rest of his reign. Either way, Arthur was dead, and Philip Augustus is screaming for vengeance. He tears his way across the Loire, marching unopposed into Normandy, town after town, falling to the French. Most saw Normandy as a lost cause, even after the victory at Mirabeau. Like Bishop Hugh of Lincoln prayed on his deathbed, cursing the Angevins to doom, Philip was the harbinger of this prophecy. All the while, Brittany assailed the southwest of Normandy, revenge for Arthur, their young lord. A truce is asked, John not wanting war, but Philip's demands were impossible. This was a war that required a military resolution. And by the summer, Philip had all but conquered Normandy. All that stood in the way was the fortress Chateau Gaillard, impregnable, undefeatable, the bastion of hope for the Normans. Under the command of Roger de Lacy, this fortress was unassailable. A rock of ages, built by Richard Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart. This was the guardian of the Seine, backed up at Andely. Philip began chipping away at the defences, isolating it, encamped. He pours all his attention on Andely. A drawn-out siege, bridges burned. Philip builds his own crossing, a slow but surgical process. A genius effort of undertaking that his old friend Richard would no doubt have appreciated. It seemed Philip was fighting his old friend, not Roger de Lacy who held it. As every step to taking the fortress was another hindsight from Richard. Slowly Philip made his way through axe and trebuchet. Arrows and other mayhem fell upon his forces, while he constructed a new bridge, a pontoon made of a string of boats, and an army camped out on the Seine. Lo behold! Neither land nor maritime assault would dislodge Philip, but John tried, putting his faith in the ageing William Marshall. Marshall raids the French camp, joining with Luscar, John's mercenary captain. He scored a victory, the pontoon breaking with the rout. But the naval reinforcements ran into trouble. The strong tide of the Seine. This bought the French time. William de Bar, the French commander who was in charge, soon had his forces regrouped, and under the cover of darkness, the French rebuilt the pontoon. Soon they were back in action. Now it was the Marshal's turn to face defeat, himself escaping. The naval reinforcements did arrive, but without the element of surprise. They were decimated by de Bar's counterattack. The French pushed forth over the pontoon and towards Andely, One Frenchman, apparently, and according to English sources, swam out and threw firebombs at the palisades, setting Underlay on fire. Few escaped. Now behold the fate of Chateau Gaillard. John tries to lure Philip out, but Philip isn't silly. Let's explore Philip. Yes, he's at war with John, but his best friend, possibly lover, built a puzzle to crack. The legendary Chateau Gaillard, the cheeky castle. Philip must have been thinking this, unpeeling Richard's defences like an onion. John lays Brittany to waste, even destroying the Cathedral of Dol and stealing relics. This doesn't faze Philip. Philip was used to manipulating the local Norman lords, not Roger de Lacy. He was an English lord with allegiance only to John. Philip decided enough was enough. He assaults Chateau Gaillard, constructing huge siege towers, enabled by manipulating the land. They dug ditches, undermining walls. Finally, the first towers fell. Into the breach they pushed. On the wall stood a chapel, not Richard's design, but John's. A chapel with a window within reach of the French, if they stood on each other's shoulders. This part of the chateau now fell. Across the drawbridge, the prize within their grasp. John was paranoid of Norman treason, expecting them to turn on him and hand him over to the French. He abandons the idea of saving the doomed fortress. But John is acting without logic here. He first locks himself away in his solar, before escaping. He flees to Rouen, his mind unsound. On the 5th of December, in 1203, John is back in England to seek advice from his barons. But they didn't see a way past this and feared the worst, as the king had brought his wife Isabella from her lands in Rouen. This was a one-way trip. He would never return. Meanwhile, Roger de Lacy's forces were reduced to just the main keep. French were everywhere. Another tower undermined. A counter thwarted. Hope fell. Trebuchet felled another. And when starvation was too much to bear, Hugh de Lacy surrendered. Chateau Gaillard was taken on March the 6th, 1204. The fortress had held out for 6 months. With this, Normandy swiftly fell. With Gaillard fallen, John joked of hunting animals. Send them to Normandy, we'll hunt. But this was mere bravado. The news hit him like a brick. This was the end of the English rule of Normandy. The map was changing to something more recognisable to us today. In late March, London, John summons a council. Again, there should be attempt at peace, and ambassadors were sent, led by Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury. It contains the bishops of Norwich and Ely, 2 earls including William Marshal and a papal legate. With haste they set off. More bad news. Philip sends his allies south into Aquitaine. It seemed too much for the venerable lady. Eleanor of Aquitaine passed away on April the 1st, 1204. Like a candle in a sconce when the wind strikes. The candle blew out. She was already no longer able to take in her surroundings. She was 82. Eleanor was interred at Fontevraud Abbey beside her estranged husband and her beloved son Richard, consecrated as a nun, marking the end of an era. Then Aquitaine swore loyalty to France. Henry II's empire had crumbled. The bigger problem being, John's magnates were all Anglo-Norman. They were losing land by the hour with no hope of taking it back. This would test loyalty. Side with John and the realm of England, or keep your lands in Normandy and side with Philip of France. Many relinquished their English lands and remained in Normandy, welcoming the French with open arms. After all, they spoke French, more or less. They had French customs, participated in all the tournaments, the best ones being in France. They had no quarrel with their neighbours, outside of loyalty to John. If anything, it was the English part that was problematic to them. Others surrendered land in Normandy, but this didn't mean they returned to duty. No, they took coin and retired, living their lives in England, away from the palaver. The kingdom was in chaos. John tries to redistribute territory, but traditions and long-held rules were firmly in place, so it all rested with these talks with Philip. The ambassadors in Paris bickered and argued with Philip all through April. Nothing was coming out of these futile talks. King Philip did not want peace, writes our friend Ralph of Coggeshal. Even our man William Marshal was weighing the pros and cons. Now, taking mind, he's loyal to a fault to the throne, not the king per se, but the throne. He would remain so, redirecting his influence away from the continent, though through negotiations he was one of the few who kept both English and Norman lands. It is my personal opinion, but it does seem that these talks, upon realising that peace was futile, decided to say bugger John and negotiate his own private deal. Can't blame him. Because Philip isn't listening, and once the delegates leave, he throws his forces at Flores, the birthplace of William the Conqueror, taking the town. There was no resistance. No one was strong enough to defend the Cherbourg Peninsula as Philip took town after town. Even ruin would strike truce. William Marshall's histories say John tries to muster at Portsmouth, but indolence strikes the barons, who dithered and delayed, costing valuable time. The continent belonged to the French. Back in England, there was understandably chaos. Most of John's council were Norman and had lost everything. Even those like William Marshal, who had struck private deals, had done so under one condition. They give Philip 500 silver marks, and homage had to be given within a year. They now had a dilemma. Could they really hope to respect both John for England and Philip for Normandy? John wanted the lands back and feared he wouldn't share power. Serving two kings seemed the only logical option, and John even considered it. But was it really possible to pay homage to both Angevin and Aquitaine? Retaking the continental lands would be a mammoth effort, and, as I said before, indolence was setting in. As for barons who remained in Normandy, their lands in England were seized. The continent truly seemed lost. It was time for John to look at England, look to home, cut his losses and start anew. After all the tax problems inherited by his brother Richard were long gone. This was actually a time of prosperity. England's economy was booming, even despite inflation and bad harvests. But prices had almost doubled in the past 5 years, and not aided by the drop in quality of the coinage. Sterling means fixed rate, more or less. But in John's reign, silver was variable. You even had two types of pennies, weak and strong. John's own mints also seemed to be undercutting coins by producing underweight currency. Coin clipping was also a problem. Basically, coins matched their weight in gold and silver. They were hammer-struck, which often caused irregularities. You couldn't just throw it back in the fire and redo it once they struck the struck. These irregularities could be clipped, sliced off, then reforged. An old way of counterfeiting. So imagine the case. You are a trader. You receive a weak coin. You're probably going to ask for more to equal the weight. Keep it to the fixed sterling. Now, instead of paying 1 penny, someone's paying 2 pennies. Now imagine you've saved up a hoard. You might want to sell, really buggering up the market. As he may have guessed, this was a recipe for disaster, and the boom would soon come crashing down. John would try to mitigate the oncoming crash. He calls for reform. All of those weak coins are no longer legal tender. But oddly, the one time he needed to be the classic draconian King John, he treats the situation lightly, and these weak coins stay in circulation. By 1205, there was even a rumour that Philip of France was set to invade English shores. His ranks were swelling, and many living in Normandy had lost lands in England and wanted them back, and many people had returned from the disastrous Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople by the Christians. Many living in Normandy had lost their lands in England and wanted them back. John doesn't hesitate to raise an army, calling men to arms in London, where our friend Ralph of Coggeshal in the Chronicle Anglicanum says that the Thames was frozen and could be crossed on foot. Take in mind, this was a medieval warm period as well. Anyway, in London, new measures were set, pushing penalties on those that refuse, calling on yet more scutage, the shield money. Basically, the nobility provided the king with military service, or they paid a fine if they wanted to get out of it. This was scutage. And in this case, John had called it for the 5th time in 3 years. Let's explore this. Richard had called 4 in 10 years. Henry, 8 in his whole reign, about 35 years. John was totally out of order calling for this many in such short time. To add insult to injury, he copied his brother. Anyone dodging war by paying scutage now paid an extra penalty on top of that. Stealth tax, basically. As for the masses, everyone from the age of 12 upwards was required to make an oath of loyalty to John. He was preparing for the worst. Philip had proven to be a formidable general. John was no doubt trying desperately to weed out oathbreakers. 2 magnates are mentioned in the texts. Ranulph de Blondeville, the Earl of Chester, stepfather of Arthur of Brittany. He'd known the king since he was a teenager, but they'd never gotten along, and though there is no evidence that he was bothered about the death of the boy, thus indifferent, John had his estates seized anyway. Roger de Montbegon had lands in Hornby, up in the rebellious north. There'd always been a north and south divide, as customs was completely different, and his estates were also seized. And they wouldn't be the only ones, but these are the only 2 mentioned in the text. Though by March, John had forgiven them. Loyalty had been restored. John even dropped the scutage. More importantly, they demanded, the barons, that John also swore an oath that he would uphold the kingdom, free from violation, to the best of his ability. No doubt the seeds of Magna Carta. The king wasn't listening to his barons, and they were reining him in. Highly important with the looming threat of a French invasion, which looked imminent. From Winchester, John summons a war council. 1 knight in every 10 was to muster in London. And this time, he'd be the aggressor. 2 separate forces were formed. One at Portsmouth, where there was a naval base, courtesy of Richard the Lionheart. He'd also built the skeleton of a fleet, the other at Dartmouth. The assumption was that Philip was amassing his forces at Poitou. John was possibly going to attack the French from the south, but there was also a possibility that he'd split his forces into a two-pronged attack. Our boy Ralph tells us that the Normans were in such fear of John's wrath that they simply abandoned their castles and estates along the coast of the continent. To bolster his fleet, John commandeers many ships. This was a huge effort. Though Ralph of Coggeshal mainly complains about the cost. John then postpones the muster and moves the effort to Northampton. Crossbowmen are demanded by the hundreds. Prisoners of all kinds of crimes are pardoned if they joined the war effort, under the guise of a pious act, in memory of his late mother, Eleanor. From Northampton to Portsmouth, where the docks are rammed with waiting ships, apparently around 1,500, the largest fleet ever mustered at this time, with an equally large army. Meanwhile, William Marshal, as part of his deal with Philip, headed to France to pay homage. This didn't bode well with John, and Marshal's reputation barely stays intact. John even denies sending him on the ill-fated peace mission that created the mess in the first place. John was not a happy bunny. In Portsmouth at the harbour, John summons the Marshal. To witness this are several other high-ranking barons. John wants to know what on earth is going on, with the Marshal apparently arguing he was acting on John's orders to make peace with Philip, but John is denying flatly that he sent him in the first place. They are both right, as yes, the Marshal was sent to France to treat with Philip, but John had certainly not ordered this double homage. He may have given it thought for a brief period, but it had swiftly left his mind. John wants William, as a part of this new war effort, to attack Poitou and wrest the lands back, but the Marshal refuses. John is angry and wants to punish Marshal. Only the barons present refuse his orders, sending John into a rage. The bugger was Marshal had demanded the archaic trial by combat, and William Marshal was the best knight in the kingdom. He was legendary, even though he was approaching 60 at this point. His military prowess was formidable. No one wanted to accept the challenge, and for Marshal it was a matter of honour. Having failed to dress down the living legend, John retires in a cold fury, still fuming over the stalemate. And he still had an invasion to prepare. But the Marshal himself hadn't finished with the king. While the last supplies were being loaded onto the ships, he appears again with Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor. The invasion is to be called off. You see, the supposed allies in Poitou were no friends. They'll most definitely betray John. There's no safe haven there. John was vastly outnumbered. The whole invasion was folly, suicide even, and the king had no heirs. Should he die, the throne would be vacant. Easy pickings for Philip. And even if they did successfully invade, Philip would no doubt do what he always does, avoid John and do his own thing. He'll invade England and no one would be there to oppose him. Worse for John, the Marshal, along with the Chancellor, had the support of the barons. That little deal the king had about paying homage to the kingdom? They were holding him to account. All of a sudden, John finds himself on his own. But John still doesn't back down. His rule is absolute. He has a tantrum. He has to be physically restrained by the Marshal, the Archbishop, and several others until fully calmed down. A necessary act to save the kingdom. He's gone insane. And in June 1205, John unwillingly makes his way to Winchester, weeping all the way and making a great fuss. He has a momentary lapse of reason and gives his household guards the slip. There's a right merry chase, with John going off grid. People thought he'd utterly lost his mind and crossed to the Channel to face Philip alone. But thankfully, he was a lot closer to home. The Isle of Wight, in fact. Letting his tantrum ride its course, he sails around the Isle for a couple of days. He eventually comes to his senses and arrives in Dorset, Studland Bay, on the 16th of June. While in Portsmouth, the largest fleet and army ever mustered was disbanded. The war was over. But his argument with William Marshal is far from over. The Marshal had always warned the barons of John's penchant for revenge. And he was to be proven right. John now demands a hostage, Marshal's eldest son, also William, a 15-year-old lad. He must have feared for his son's safety, given what happened to Arthur, yet he had no choice but to obey. Unlike the fate of Arthur, the young Marshal seems to have got along fine under John's wardship. He remains there until he's around 22. As for his father, the ageing William Marshal was pretty much pushed out of main duties. Like so many before him, he had fallen from grace. John, at least, was back to his usual self, spending 2 weeks at his favourite hunting lodges in Dorset and Wiltshire, his favourite pastime. During this time, he learnt that a few castles had resisted Philip, including Chinon. But alas, they'd recently fallen. This news brought the first of 2 great storms that would ravage the kingdom. On the night of the 24th of June, during the feast of John the Baptist, thunder rocked the skies and winds ravaged. An ill omen indeed. There was more bad news. The Chancellor and Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, had been travelling from Canterbury to Boxley Abbey in order to sort out a dispute with the Cistercian monks. Yet on the journey, Hubert becomes afflicted with the deadly anthrax disease. In the nether regions, Ralph of Coggeshal tells us, in the suburbs below the belt, on the antepenultimate spondyle of his back, broke out the disease. This brought on a deadly fever, and Hubert was confined to his rooms at Tenham, nearby. It took the poor man 4 painful days to die. And on the 13th of July, 1205, he passed away. Not that John saw it as bad news. He was apparently overjoyed, announcing that finally he was the King of England. He could make his own rules. So now John's in Canterbury, making sure the next Archbishop won't be troublesome. Not that this would be easy, as arguments to who the next bishop actually is are already in full swing by the time he arrives. Then came the second storm that rocked the kingdom on the Feast of St. James. 2 storms, 2 holy days disrupted. This second storm was far greater than before. Crashes of thunder, lightning setting houses on fire. Trees were uprooted and scattered. People and animals died. Hailstones as big as donkey's eggs are reported. Donkey's eggs. Ralph certainly had a sense of humour. As a man who remembers the hurricane of 1987, the writings of Ralph of Coggeshal are eerily familiar. At the dawn of the 13th century, it was seen as biblical. Even monsters were sighted. One had the head of a donkey and the body of a man, burned beyond recognition, others in the form of strange footprints. apparently the work of demons. For a Cistercian monk like Ralph, it makes sense that he begins to ramble on about judgment and good and bad angels. As far as he was concerned, the end times were upon the world. This was it. Apparently, the people in general feared this disaster greatly. Now, John has only been king around 5 years, and is already seeing the loss of Normandy, in fact all of the continental lands, a rebellion of his magnates, the disbanding of the largest naval and land army ever seen, and with it the hopes are dashed of retaking all the lost lands. There's an economic crash, the murder of Arthur, and an untimely and horrible death of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and 2 cataclysmic storms. I think we can forgive our Ralph for being a little bit melodramatic.